Welcome to this series of videos that's going to take you through the answers to the January mock paper that you should have just completed. We're going to start off with question 1A. Question 1A asks you what information is required in order to calculate the growth rate of a population. When you see a question like this, you should think of the equation that you learned earlier on in the course that showed you what factors affected the growth rate of a population. And go put that equation up on the screen now. This is the equation. It tells you that population growth rate is equal to birth rate minus death rate plus immigration minus emigration. So you can see from this that there are 4 different factors that affect population growth rate. If I wanted to calculate the growth rate of a population, I would need to know all 4 of those things. So the answer to this question is going to be those 4 factors there. This should be the answer then. We have birth rate, death rate, immigration and emigration. Now in reality the examiners actually only gave you marks for the first 2 of these. So there was a mark for birth rate and there was a mark for death rate. There weren't any marks for immigration and emigration, but on previous questions of this type on other papers there have been marks available for those points, so I'd still put that information in there. Moving on to question 1B, we're presented with an age population pyramid. Looking at this pyramid you can immediately see that it's got a fairly wide base and it's got a fairly narrow top. Now that should be suggesting to you a country that has quite a high birth rate, a relatively high death rate, possibly a country which doesn't have a brilliant healthcare system and where people aren't expected to live that far into old age. You can see on this age population pyramid that we've got a very wide base, and that's signifying to us that we've got a very large percentage of people in this population who are below 5 years of age. Equally, there's only a very small percentage of people, less than 1%, who are living past their 85th birthday. So that suggests that, as I said, this is a country with a fairly high birth rate, fairly low death rate, and it suggests that it's in the very early stages of a demographic transition, perhaps in stage 1. Moving it further down, our question states that the country is at a very early stage of a demographic transition, and it wants the evidence for this. So the answer we're going to want for this question is going to relate to the high birth rate and high death rate that we've just identified from our pyramid. So this is what we'll be looking to put down, and it must be high birth rate and high death rate. You've got to use those words rate. Moving on to question 2, we've got a graph to do with algae, and it tells us that algae are photosynthesizing organisms and that some grow on rocky shores. It then gives you details of an experiment that a scientist has carried out to investigate succession. That word succession immediately tells you what this question is about. It's about the topic of succession. You're then shown the graph with the results of this experiment in, and you can see that the different species vary in their percentage cover over time. On this bottom axis here you've got time in months. We can see to begin with that one species, this species called Ulva lactusa, increases very rapidly up to about 9 months and then decreases. That species, Ulva lactusa, appears to be the first species that's getting established in this ecosystem. I've gone a little bit off target there. The other species then seems to be appearing later. So it looks like Ulva lactusa is the pioneer species, the species that's appearing first in succession. The other species then start increasing a bit later on in their abundance, and as these other species, which I won't try and pronounce here, increase in abundance, the Ulva lactusa is decreasing in abundance, probably due to competition. You should always try and get your head around a graph like this before you start answering the question. The first question then is asking us for the name of the pioneer species, and we know that that species is Ulva lactusa. The question goes on then to ask why percentage cover rather than frequency was used to record the abundance of the algae present. Percentage cover means that the scientists have probably put a quadrat down on top of the concrete blocks I mentioned earlier, and they've tried to estimate what percentage of the quadrat was covered with algae, or had algae underneath the field of view. The alternative to that would be using abundance, which means simply counting the number of individuals present. Now to help answer this question, I've shown you a picture of some algae. This is a picture of algae that someone's picked out of a pond, and you can see that the algae are very, very small. In fact, from a distance it looks like one continuous sort of sludge, although there are individual algae in that picture. From this picture you can see that algae are not going to be easy organisms to count. They're very small and counting them will be pretty much impossible. So that's why we need to use percentage cover, because with a very small organism like algae, counting individuals is nearly impossible. So this is the answer that we're looking for. The reason that percentage cover was used rather than abundance is that it's very difficult to count individual algae due to their small size. Moving further on to question 2, we have what I call a how science works question, as in a question that's about how scientists carry out and design experiments. It says that some scientists reviewing this investigation were concerned about the validity of the results because of the use of concrete blocks, and it asks you to suggest one reason why the scientists were concerned. For this question, it's very helpful if we understand that term validity. Luckily we've got Wikipedia to help us out in case we were stuck, and Wikipedia, obviously a reliable source, but in this case it's perfectly okay. In this case Wikipedia tells us that validity is the extent to which a concept, conclusion or measurement is well founded and corresponds accurately to the real world. In this case, the measurement and the conclusion that the scientist is drawing is to do with the succession of algae. The scientist wants to find out how succession of algae happens in the normal natural environment, but in order to study this, the scientist has put concrete blocks into this environment. So the danger with this experiment is that by putting the concrete blocks into the natural environment, the scientist has changed the conditions that are normally present during succession, and that might mean that the conclusions the scientists draw are not valid, as in do not accurately reflect the situation in the real world. I've put on the board here the answer that we're looking for, and we're looking for something like this. I've written the concrete blocks have a different texture or chemical composition to the natural environment where succession takes place. The key part of this answer is the bit about texture or chemical composition. For AQA exams, you need to be specific. If you'd have just said that the concrete blocks alter the natural environment or are different from the natural environment, that wouldn't have been enough. You need to be highly specific when you answer a question for an AQA exam in biology. So the fact that it's a different texture or a different chemical composition, either one of those on their own would be fine, is the key part of this answer. If you had a different suggestion that was to do with how the concrete blocks were different from the natural environment, that would be fine as well. But you had to go a bit further than just saying that the concrete blocks are different. Moving on to the last part of question 2, we have a question that asks us to use the results of this investigation to describe and explain the process of succession. I've highlighted the 3 instructions the examiners have given us here. They want an answer that describes succession and explains it, and they want us to use the results of our investigation. If we're going to use the results of our investigation, we're going to have to be referring back to that graph on the previous page, and we're going to have to be using the names of those species. We're also going to have to try and explain what's going on as well as describing. So that means that somewhere in our answer we should have the word because. One thing you might want to try when you're answering questions like this, where the examiners give you multiple different instructions, is putting cues for yourself along the left-hand margin of the exam paper. So in this case I've put 2 cues on the page for me. I've put a little instruction to myself on the left hand side reminding me that I have to describe succession, and then I've got one a bit further down trying to remind me to explain succession, and I've also put that I need to use the results of this investigation. So if I put my description up here and my explanation down here, perhaps to give myself a bit more space there, then I should answer that question thoroughly and hopefully I'll get all 4 marks. I'm going to have to say quite a lot here and get plenty of keywords in here because it is a 4-mark question. So I've put on my description of succession, and I've said that in succession a pioneer species first colonises a hostile environment and increases in abundance. What I've then done is I've used the information from the graph, and I've said that in this case the pioneer species is Ulva lactusa. Now you'll note that I've used a capital U and a lowercase l here, and the same for my previous answer where I used that name. You must do that when you're giving the full proper Latin names of species. It must be a capital letter for the first word and then a lowercase letter for the second one. Carrying on with my description, I've said that the pioneer species makes the environment less hostile, allowing other species to colonise the environment. And I've said that in this case, the other species, G. caniculata, G. leptorhynchos and Gelidium coulteri, are the other species that the graph shows us start to appear once the pioneer species has made the environment less hostile. So I've used those names to make sure I've used data from the graph, and you can see I've used the word abundance in both cases, and I'm trying to get keywords into this answer, so I want to use words like keyword, like abundance, hostile, pioneer species, to make sure that I'm getting the mark scheme points. Now I've not really finished my description, and I haven't used the word because yet, so I'm going to finish off this by explaining what happens as we go on through succession, and also making sure that I've explained why that happens and used the word because. So here's what I've finished off with, and you can see I've put the word because in this last part of the answer. I've said that the abundance of the original pioneer species, Ulvalactusa, eventually decreases because the other species outcompete it for resources. So looking at my answer here, I've got a thorough description of what happens in succession. I've explained why this step at the end happens using the word because, and I've used names and data from the graph throughout this process. So that hopefully should get me all my marks, and if we refer to the mark scheme, it does.